General Susan Carter stood in the war room beneath the Rocky Mountains and watched as Earth's military leaders coordinated the largest mobilization in human history. Representatives from every nation worked together under a unified command structure for the first time since the planet's formation. The irony wasn't lost on Carter that humanity's greatest period of cooperation was happening in preparation for galaxy-wide warfare. Dr. Tony Mitchell led research teams around the clock as they worked to adapt human weapons technology for fighting an enemy that could manipulate matter and consciousness. His laboratories buzzed with activity as scientists raced to understand devourer capabilities and develop countermeasures before the ancient enemy could complete their galactic offensive. Captain Rob Wilson commanded the first human battle fleet to leave the Sol system carrying weapons specifically designed to counter devourer technology. His ships represented the cutting edge of human military engineering, built with lessons learned from studying the ancient installations that Rogers had discovered throughout their home system. Director Ashley Johnson managed the complex political task of integrating human forces with Federation defenses while maintaining the independence that made humans effective against psychological warfare. The Federation Council struggled to understand military concepts that were intuitive to humans, but nearly incomprehensible to species that had evolved beyond competitive survival strategies. Carter coordinated with military leaders across Earth as they prepared for a conflict unlike anything in human history. The enemy they faced didn't just want to conquer territory or resources. The Devourers sought to consume the very concept of resistance from their victims, leaving behind empty shells that could no longer imagine fighting back. Mitchell's research revealed that human psychological traits considered antisocial by Federation standards were actually crucial advantages against Devourer technology. Stubbornness, aggression, and refusal to acknowledge defeat created mental patterns that the ancient enemy couldn't decode or manipulate through their consciousness suppression systems. Wilson's fleet arrived at the Centauri system just as a massive Devourer force emerged from hidden installations near the colony's primary star. The Federation defenders had already been paralyzed by psychological attacks that drained their will to resist. Wilson found himself commanding the only functional military force in a system containing over 50 million civilians. Johnson worked frantically to coordinate Federation supply lines with human tactical requirements as the scope of the conflict became clear. The Devourers had awakened installations across the galaxy simultaneously, creating multiple crisis points that stretched both human and Federation resources beyond their limits. The first major engagement demonstrated the fundamental difference between human and alien approaches to warfare. Federation ships that had survived the initial psychological attacks tried to retreat and regroup according to their species' natural conflict avoidance instincts. Human forces immediately began harassment attacks designed to wear down Devourer resources through prolonged attrition. Carter received battle reports from across the galaxy as human forces engaged Devourer fleets at dozens of locations. The ancient enemy had clearly expected their psychological weapons to achieve the same rapid victories they had accomplished against other species. Human immunity to despair-based attacks was forcing them to rely on conventional warfare for the first time in millennia. Mitchell made a crucial breakthrough when he discovered that Devourer technology required their victims to acknowledge defeat on some fundamental psychological level. The consciousness suppression systems worked by convincing entire populations that resistance was futile and surrender was inevitable. Human minds simply didn't contain the mental frameworks that allowed such complete capitulation. Wilson's forces at Centauri demonstrated human tactical flexibility as they adapted to each new Devourer capability that emerged during the battle. When the enemy deployed matter manipulation weapons, humans responded with distributed attack patterns that prevented effective targeting. When Devourers attempted psychological warfare, humans ignored the attacks and continued their assault plans. Johnson documented the transformation of Federation attitudes toward human military doctrine as the conflict progressed. Species that had initially viewed human aggression as primitive barbarism began to understand that systematic violence could be a form of sophisticated problem-solving when applied to the right situations. The turning point came when Carter authorized the deployment of human forces to protect Federation population centers that were under direct Devourer assault. human ships arrived at colony worlds where the local defenders had been reduced to catatonic states by psychological attacks. The presence of naturally resistant human minds disrupted Devourer control systems and allowed Federation civilians to regain their mental functions. Mitchell's analysis of captured Devourer technology revealed that the ancient enemy had spent thousands of years perfecting techniques for inducing surrender without physical combat. Their entire military philosophy was based on the assumption that all intelligent species possessed psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to achieve instant victory. Wilson led a combined human Federation force toward the Galactic core where the main Devourer installation had been broadcasting the psychological attacks that paralyzed entire star systems. The mission represented humanity's first major offensive operation beyond their home system, and would determine whether human tactical doctrine could succeed against an enemy with superior technology. Carter coordinated the largest military operation in human history as forces from every Earth nation contributed ships and personnel to the Galactic core assault. The battle plan relied on human psychological traits that other species found disturbing, but that had proven effective against Devourer consciousness manipulation. The climactic battle at the Galactic core became a testament to human tactical adaptability as Wilson's forces faced Devourer capabilities that defied conventional understanding of warfare. The ancient enemy could manipulate space-time, alter matter at the molecular level, and project psychological attacks across interstellar distances. None of these advantages mattered against opponents who refused to accept that any situation was truly hopeless. Johnson managed supply lines that stretched across half the galaxy, as human forces maintained pressure against Devourer positions, despite suffering casualties that would have broken the morale of any other species. Federation observers struggled to understand how humans could continue fighting effectively while absorbing losses that represented strategic defeats by any rational analysis. Mitchell's final breakthrough came when he realized that the Devourer's greatest strength was also their fundamental weakness. Their reliance on psychological manipulation had left them unprepared for opponents who viewed impossible odds as challenges rather than reasons for surrender. The ancient enemy had never developed effective strategies for dealing with species that treated warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a trauma to be avoided. The Galactic core battle ended when human forces succeeded in disrupting the main Devourer installation through the simple expedient of refusing to stop attacking, regardless of casualties or tactical setbacks. The ancient enemy's consciousness suppression technology failed completely when faced with minds that were psychologically incapable of accepting defeat. Carter stood in the same war room where the crisis had begun and watched as reports came in from across the galaxy confirming that Devourer forces were retreating into dormancy once again. The ancient enemy had been forced to acknowledge that their psychological warfare techniques were useless against a species that treated persistence as a virtue rather than a flaw. Wilson returned to Earth with a fleet that had proven human military. Doctrine could succeed against impossible odds when applied with sufficient determination. The galaxy had learned that the quarantine warning had been accurate after all. Earth was indeed marked as containing the most dangerous species in known space, but only because humanity was the only species dangerous enough to matter when true threats emerged from the darkness between stars. The aftermath of the conflict saw humanity take its place not as conquerors, but as the galaxy's guardians, the species willing to face impossible odds because their nature made surrender, literally, unthinkable. The ancient quarantine had been humanity's gift to the universe, preserving the one civilization capable of standing against enemies that conquered through despair rather than force. Dr. Emma Foster stood in the ancient archive chamber deep beneath the Federation's oldest research station and stared at files that hadn't been opened for thousands of years. The archaeological team had been working for weeks to access the sealed records that might explain humanity's mysterious quarantine. What they found challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about its own history. The files were written in multiple extinct languages and stored on crystalline data cores that required specialized equipment to read. Foster's translation computers worked around the clock to decode text that described events from an era when the galaxy was a very different and much more dangerous place. Commander Nick Peterson reviewed the translated records from his position aboard the human observation ship, Earth's military intelligence had insisted on having representatives present when the ancient files were opened. Peterson's job was to analyze anything. That might explain why humanity had been isolated for so long. The first major discovery came when Foster's team realized that the quarantine records were much older than anyone had suspected. The isolation of Earth's sector hadn't begun 3,000 years ago as the Federation believed. The real quarantine had been established nearly 12,000 years ago, during a period that Federation historians called the Dark Time. Chancellor Vera Donovan received the archaeological team's preliminary report at her private estate on the Federation's oldest colony world. Donovan was one of the few beings in the galaxy who still remembered the stories that her ancestors had passed down about the ancient wars. Her species, the Zenith, had once been warriors before they learned to fear what lay hidden in the darkness between stars. Foster's translation computers finally broke through the language barriers and began producing readable text from the ancient files. The records described a galaxy-wide conflict against entities that the files called devourers. These beings had swept across civilized space, consuming entire star systems and leaving nothing but empty darkness behind them. Peterson read the battle reports with growing amazement. The tactical descriptions matched human military doctrine with frightening accuracy. Concepts like strategic withdrawal, asymmetric warfare, and scorched earth tactics appeared throughout the records. The ancient files described these ideas as revolutionary innovations that no one had ever seen before. Captain Steve Rogers piloted his reconnaissance ship through the outer edges of the Sol system while monitoring Federation communications. His mission was to investigate the strange installations that long-range scanners had detected on several asteroids and dead moons. What Rogers found changed his understanding of human history completely. The installations were clearly not human in origin. They were built from materials that human science couldn't identify and powered by energy sources that defied current understanding of physics. Most disturbing of all, the installations showed signs of violent destruction that matched the battle damage described in the ancient Federation records. Chancellor Donovan arrived at the archaeological site with a small fleet of ships from the old faction that had originally established the quarantine. She had hoped never to see these records opened again. Her ancestors had survived the Devourer Wars and passed down warnings about the one species that had refused to run when faced with impossible odds. Dr. Foster, you have no idea what you're uncovering, Donovan said as she walked into the archive chamber. My people were among the survivors who escaped from the war zones during the Devourer crisis. We were renowned warriors before we encountered those monsters. They broke us in less than a week. Foster looked up from her translation work with confusion and concern. Chancellor, the records indicate that most species either fled or were consumed by the Devourers within solar cycles. But there's one species mentioned repeatedly that seems to have successfully resisted. The files call them the Persistence Warriors from the Third World. Donovan's face grew pale as she realized what Foster was discovering. Doctor, the reason we quarantined that sector wasn't to protect the galaxy from the humans. We quarantined it because we were terrified of what would happen if humans ever learned what their ancestors had accomplished. The ancient records revealed that every civilization encountered by the Devourers had followed the same pattern. First came paralyzing fear, then desperate attempts to negotiate or appease the invaders, and finally complete surrender when resistance proved futile. Every civilization except one. Peterson analyzed the battle reports that described human resistance to the Devourer invasion. The humans had not fled, negotiated, or surrendered. Instead, they had adapted their tactics with each defeat and continued fighting long after any rational analysis would have declared their cause hopeless. The Devourers had never encountered a species that refused to acknowledge defeat. Rogers discovered more evidence of the ancient conflict as he explored the destroyed installations throughout the Sol system. The damage patterns suggested that the Devourers had established multiple staging areas around Earth, intending to use the system as a launching point for consuming the galactic core. Something had gone very wrong with their plans. Foster's team uncovered the final pieces of the puzzle when they accessed the most heavily protected files in the archive. The records described how the human ancestors had not only survived the Devourer invasion, but had systematically hunted down and eliminated every single Devourer presence in their system. The ancient files used words like relentless and implacable to describe human pursuit of the fleeing invaders. Chancellor Donovan explained the truth that her faction had hidden for thousands of years. The Devourers were creatures that fed on the concept of resistance itself. They could drain the will to fight from entire civilizations within days. But humans possessed something that the Devourers couldn't understand or consume. They called it persistence beyond reason. The ancient warnings finally made sense when Foster translated the complete quarantine orders. The galaxy hadn't isolated Earth to protect itself from human diseases or violence. They had quarantined Earth because the human victory over the Devourers had been so complete and so terrifying that other species feared what humans might do if they ever turned their attention to the rest of the galaxy. Peterson compiled his intelligence analysis and sent it to Earth's leadership through encrypted channels. The report revealed that humanity's ancestors had accomplished something that every other species in galactic history had failed to do. They had faced an enemy that consumed civilizations and had not only survived but had driven that enemy into retreat or dormancy. Rogers made the most disturbing discovery when his sensors detected energy signatures from the destroyed Devourer installations that matched readings from multiple locations across the galaxy. The ancient enemy that humans had defeated was still out there, waiting in the darkness between stars. The investigation of Earth had somehow triggered monitoring systems that had been dormant for millennia. Chancellor Donovan's worst fears were confirmed when her ships detected the same energy signatures that Rogers had found. Dr. Foster, your archaeological investigation has awakened something that should have stayed sleeping. The Devourers weren't destroyed by the humans. They were forced into hibernation, and now they know that the Persistence warriors are no longer isolated. The ancient records contained one final warning that sent chills through everyone who read it. The original quarantine hadn't been established to protect the galaxy from humanity. It had been established to preserve humanity as the galaxy's last hope against the return of an enemy that would inevitably wake from its long sleep. The isolation had kept humans focused on developing the very traits that made them effective against impossible odds. Foster realized that the galaxy was about to face the return of its greatest nightmare, and the only species capable of fighting it had been deliberately kept ignorant of their true nature and purpose. The ancient warnings had been ignored not because they were false, but because their real meaning had been lost to time and fear. Dr. Ron Hayes stared at the impossible readings from the ancient Devourer installation that Captain Rogers had discovered on Europa. The technology defied every law of physics that human science understood. Energy flowed in patterns that shouldn't exist, manipulating space and time in ways that made Hayes question his fundamental understanding of reality. Admiral Grace Thompson stood on the bridge of Earth's flagship as the combined Human Federation fleet prepared for the largest deep space expedition in galactic history. The mission was simple in concept but terrifying in scope. They needed to investigate every former Devourer site across the galaxy and determine whether the ancient enemy was truly dormant or simply waiting for the right moment to emerge. Prime Minister Alan Cooper convened an emergency session of the Federation Council as reports flooded in from monitoring stations across civilized space. Long-dormant systems were activating throughout the galaxy, broadcasting signals that matched the energy signatures found around Earth. Whatever the archaeological investigation had awakened was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Captain Linda Ward served as the diplomatic liaison between human and Federation forces as the joint expedition prepared to depart. Her job was to help two completely different military philosophies work together against an enemy that neither side fully understood. The Federation approached warfare as a last resort, while humans seemed to treat it as an inevitable extension of politics. Hayes made his first breakthrough when he successfully interfaced human computers with Devourer technology. The alien systems responded to mathematical queries with information that revolutionized human understanding of physics. The Devourers had mastered technologies that allowed them to manipulate matter at the quantum level and influence the fundamental forces that held the universe together. Thompson's fleet discovered that the Federation's peaceful nature had left them completely unprepared for the kind of conflict they now faced. Federation ships carried minimal defensive systems, and their crews had no experience with military tactics beyond basic security protocols. Human vessels, by contrast, had been designed with warfare in mind, even during peacetime exploration missions. Cooper struggled to explain human military concepts to Federation representatives who had never experienced organized conflict. Ideas like acceptable losses and strategic withdrawal were foreign to species that had evolved cooperative rather than competitive survival strategies. The Federation Council found it difficult to understand why humans would willingly sacrifice resources for long-term tactical advantages. Ward documented the growing cultural divide between human and Federation approaches to the crisis. Federation species wanted to study the Devourer technology and attempt communication with any surviving entities. Humans wanted to identify threats and eliminate them before they could pose a danger to civilian populations. Both approaches had merit, but they were fundamentally incompatible. The first major discovery came when Hayes analyzed Devourer neural interface systems that had been found in installations across multiple star systems. The technology was designed to suppress the psychological mechanisms that allowed species to resist domination. The devices could drain hope, courage, and determination from entire populations within hours of activation. Thompson led the Joint Fleet to their first active Devourer site in the Rigel system, where Federation monitoring stations had detected energy signatures consistent with the ancient enemy. What they found was a massive installation emerging from what had appeared to be a dead moon. The structure was powering up after thousands of years of dormancy. Cooper received increasingly desperate reports from Federation colonies as more Devourer sites activated across the galaxy. The installations weren't attacking yet, but their very presence was causing psychological effects in nearby populations. Federation species began experiencing paralyzing fear and despair whenever they approached the ancient sites. Ward observed the stark difference between human and Federation responses to the Devourer installations. Federation crews required constant medical attention to combat the psychological effects of proximity to the ancient technology. Human crews seemed largely immune to the fear-inducing emanations, treating the installations as dangerous but manageable threats. Hayes discovered that Devourer technology targeted specific neural pathways that were common to most intelligent species, but were apparently underdeveloped in humans. The ancient enemy had perfected the ability to induce surrender by overwhelming their victims' capacity for hope and resistance. Human brains simply didn't respond to the psychological attacks in the expected way. Thompson's analysis of the Rigel installation revealed technology that was actively scanning Federation space and cataloging the locations of major population centers. The Devourers were gathering intelligence about current galactic civilization and preparing for what appeared to be a coordinated campaign of conquest. Cooper faced the terrible realization that the Federation's peaceful nature made them sitting targets for an enemy that specialized in psychological warfare. Species that had evolved beyond violence had also evolved beyond the mental frameworks necessary to resist entities that fed on submission and despair. Ward compiled reports from across the galaxy as more Devourer installations came online. The pattern was becoming clear. The ancient enemy hadn't been destroyed during their original conflict with humanity. They had retreated into hibernation and had been waiting for the galaxy to evolve into a more vulnerable state. The crisis reached a turning point when the main Devourer installation in the galactic core began broadcasting signals that triggered mass psychological breakdowns across multiple Federation worlds. Entire populations fell into catatonic states as their mental defenses collapsed under the weight of artificially induced hopelessness. Hayes made his most important discovery when he realized that human psychological traits that other species considered flaws were actually evolutionary advantages against Devourer technology. Stubbornness, aggression, and refusal to accept defeat were precisely the mental characteristics that made humans immune to the ancient enemy's primary weapons. Thompson organized human forces into rapid response teams designed to provide psychological support to Federation populations under Devourer influence. Human presence seemed to disrupt the ancient technology's effectiveness, suggesting that proximity to naturally resistant minds could help other species maintain their mental defenses. Cooper authorized the deployment of human military advisors to every major Federation world as the crisis expanded. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the species the galaxy had quarantined for being too violent was now their only hope for survival against an enemy that conquered through psychological manipulation. Ward documented the transformation of human federation relations as the crisis forced both sides to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. The Federation's peaceful evolution had left them defenseless against psychological warfare, while humanity's violent history had preserved the mental toughness necessary to resist despair-based attacks. The situation reached critical mass when multiple Devourer fleets emerged from hidden installations and began moving toward major population centers. The ancient enemy was no longer content to simply gather intelligence. They were preparing to complete the galactic conquest that human resistance had interrupted thousands of years earlier. Hayes realized that the original human victory over the Devourers hadn't been based on superior technology or military strategy. It had been based on humanity's psychological inability to accept defeat, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The Devourers couldn't consume what humans refused to surrender. Thompson prepared Earth's forces for the largest military mobilization in human history, as reports confirmed that the galaxy faced an enemy that had spent millennia perfecting their techniques for conquest. The ancient warnings had been proven correct. Humanity was indeed the galaxy's most dangerous species, but only because they were the only species capable of being dangerous enough to matter. President Kate Sullivan stood on the bridge of Terra's Pride and watched the alien ship approach through the viewscreen. The massive Federation vessel looked peaceful enough with its smooth curves and bright white hull. No visible weapons pointed in their direction, which Kate found both reassuring and slightly puzzling. Every human ship carried at least some defensive systems even on diplomatic missions. General Paul Miller stood beside the president and studied the alien ship through military eyes. His years of experience in Earth's various conflicts had taught him to look for signs of hidden weapons or tactical advantages. The Federation ship seemed to have neither. It moved slowly and openly, broadcasting friendship signals on every frequency it could find. "Madam President, their ship design is completely focused on exploration and science," Miller said quietly. "I see sensor arrays and communication equipment, but no obvious weapon systems. Either they're very good at hiding their armaments or they don't believe in carrying weapons at all." Kate nodded and tried to hide her surprise. Every human nation had learned long ago that peaceful intentions meant nothing without the ability to defend yourself if negotiations went wrong. The idea of traveling through unknown space in an unarmed vessel seemed almost suicidal. To her military mind, Dr. Ben Clark checked his translation equipment one more time as the two ships moved into position for the historic meeting. Earth's leading expert on alien cultures had spent months preparing for this moment. He had studied every piece of information that Commander Hunter's monitoring stations had gathered about Federation communications. What he had learned worried him more than he wanted to admit. Captain Morrison's ship docked with Terra's Pride in the space between Jupiter and Saturn. The Federation captain walked into the human ship's meeting room with Dr. Campbell and two other alien specialists. Kate studied their faces carefully, looking for any signs of deception or hidden motives. What she saw instead was genuine curiosity, mixed with something that looked almost like nervousness. "President Sullivan, on behalf of the Galactic Federation, I welcome humanity to the community of spacefaring civilizations," Captain Morrison said through his translation device. "We have traveled far to meet you and learn about your remarkable species." Kate smiled and gestured for everyone to sit around the large conference table. "Captain Morrison, we are honored by your visit. Humanity has wondered for a long time if we were alone in the universe. We're excited to learn that we have neighbors among the stars." Dr. Campbell activated her recording equipment and began asking questions about human culture and history. Her first question seemed innocent enough, focusing on art, science, and social development. Kate answered honestly, describing humanity's achievements in space exploration, medicine, and technology. The mood in the room began to change when Dr. Campbell asked about human approaches to conflict resolution. Kate explained that Earth had experienced dozens of wars throughout recorded history, and that nations still maintained military forces to protect their interests. The alien scientist's face showed confusion and something that might have been concern. "Forgive me, President Sullivan, but did you say that humans still engage in organized warfare?" Campbell asked carefully. "The Federation has maintained galactic peace for over 2,000 years. Most of our member species resolved their conflicts through negotiation and compromise centuries ago." General Miller leaned forward with interest. Dr. Campbell, how do Federation species handle situations where negotiation fails? What happens when one group refuses to compromise or threatens the safety of others? Campbell exchanged glances with Captain Morrison before answering. General, such situations simply don't arise among Federation species. Our members have evolved beyond the need for violence as a solution to disagreements. We find peaceful resolutions because warfare is not a concept that most of us can even imagine. Kate felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand what Campbell was saying. Doctor, are you telling us that human beings are the only species in the Federation that still engages in military conflict? You would be the first, President Sullivan. The Federation has encountered over 400 different species in the past 10,000 years. None of them have maintained standing military forces or engaged in organized warfare. After achieving spaceflight, violence on that scale seems to be a uniquely human characteristic. Dr. Clark spoke up from his position at the table. Captain Morrison, this raises an important question about the quarantine that kept our species isolated. If the Federation only encounters peaceful species, why was humanity marked as dangerous enough to avoid for thousands of years? Morrison's expression grew troubled as he considered the question. Dr. Clark, the truth is that we don't fully understand the original quarantine orders ourselves. The records are very old and written in languages that died out long ago. We assumed that your world carried some kind of biological contamination that would threaten other life forms. Agent Maria Santos had been listening quietly from her position near the door, but now she stepped forward with questions of her own. Her intelligence background had taught her to look for information that people might be trying to hide. The Federation representatives seemed genuinely confused about humanity's nature, but their confusion itself was revealing. Captain, you mentioned that the Federation has been peaceful for 2,000 years, Santos said carefully. What happened before that period? Were there conflicts in the galaxy's earlier history that might explain why someone would quarantine a species like humanity? Campbell consulted her datapad before answering. Agent Santos, Federation records from that time period are incomplete. We know that there was some kind of galactic crisis approximately 12,000 years ago, but most civilizations from that era either died out or lost their historical records. The quarantine orders for your sector date back to that same time period. Admiral Torres listened to the meeting through secure communication channels from his command ship. The conversation was revealing information that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The Federation had always assumed that their peaceful nature was normal for intelligent species. Learning that humans routinely engaged in warfare suggested that either humanity was abnormally violent or that the Federation had somehow lost touch with a fundamental aspect of intelligent behavior. The Admiral sent orders to his archaeological team to begin searching for older records that might explain the original quarantine. If humanity represented some kind of ancient threat, the Federation needed to understand what they were dealing with before the situation spiraled out of control. Back in the meeting room, General Miller was asking detailed questions about Federation military capabilities. Morrison's answers revealed that most Federation ships carried no weapons beyond basic defensive shields. Their exploration vessels relied entirely on diplomatic immunity and their reputation as peaceful scientists. General, the Federation maintains a few security forces for emergency situations, but we haven't faced a military threat in over 2 millennia, Morrison explained. Our conflicts are typically resolved through economic sanctions or diplomatic pressure. Physical force is simply not part of our political toolkit. Miller nodded thoughtfully, but Kate could see the concern in his eyes. Humanity had spent its entire history preparing for the possibility of hostile contact with alien species. The idea that they might be the only species in the galaxy that thought in military terms was both reassuring and terrifying. Dr. Campbell made one final entry in her cultural analysis report as the meeting concluded. Her observations of human behavior during the negotiations had revealed psychological patterns that she found deeply disturbing. The humans displayed tactical awareness, strategic thinking, and a casual familiarity with concepts of violence that seemed alien to everything she understood about intelligent life. The meeting ended with agreements to continue cultural exchanges and begin formal diplomatic relations. Both sides expressed friendship and mutual respect. Neither side mentioned their growing suspicion that humanity might represent something unique and potentially dangerous in a galaxy that had forgotten what true conflict looked like. Captain Jake Morrison stared at the strange readings on his ship's scanner and rubbed his tired eyes. The numbers made no sense at all. His exploration vessel Stellar Dawn had been mapping empty space for 3 months now, checking old quarantine zones that the Federation had marked as dead worlds thousands of years ago. This particular sector, labeled as 7G in the ancient records, was supposed to be completely lifeless. The scanner showed something very different. Energy signatures pulsed across his screen like a busy city at night. Massive structures orbited around a yellow star that the old records called Sol. Ships moved between planets in organized patterns that looked almost like trade routes. Whatever lived in this system was not only alive but thriving in ways that made Jake's head spin. Dr. Lisa Campbell walked onto the bridge carrying a datapad full of translation files. She had been working for days to decode the original quarantine warnings, using every language program the Federation had in its databases. Her face showed the same confusion that Jake felt in his gut. "Captain, I think we have a serious problem," Lisa said as she handed him the datapad. "The original quarantine records are not what we thought they were. The warnings are written in an old language that died out about 10,000 years ago. My translation software keeps giving me strange phrases that don't make sense." Jake looked at the translated text on the screen. Words like apex persistence and warfare instinct appeared over and over again in the ancient warnings. The Federation had always believed that this sector contained a plague world that would kill any organic life that came too close. The real warnings seemed to describe something much more dangerous than any disease. What kind of civilization could survive in a quarantine zone for this long? Jake asked as he watched more energy readings appear on his scanner. The Federation avoided this entire sector for 3,000 years. "We thought everything here was dead." Lisa shook her head and pointed to more translation errors on her screen. The warnings mentioned something called survival beyond reason. "Captain, I don't think this quarantine was meant to protect us from a disease. I think it was meant to protect us from whatever species lives on that third planet." Jake felt a cold feeling in his stomach as he realized what Lisa was suggesting. The Federation had encountered thousands of species across the galaxy over the past 10,000 years. Every single one of them had been peaceful or easy to communicate with. The idea that an entire sector had been marked off limits because of one dangerous species seemed impossible. Admiral Ryan Torres received Jake's emergency transmission at Federation headquarters 3 days later. The message contained scanner readings and partial translations that made the old admiral question everything he thought he knew about galactic history. Torres had been in charge of first contact situations for over 20 years and had never seen anything like this. The admiral immediately called an emergency meeting with the Federation Council. The most senior members of every major species gathered in the Great Hall to discuss what to do about the Sector 7G situation. Some wanted to send a full military fleet to investigate. Others wanted to strengthen the quarantine and pretend they had never detected anything unusual, Commander. Alex Hunter sat in a hidden monitoring station on the dark side of Earth's moon and listened to every word of the Federation's emergency communications. Earth had been detecting alien signals for the past 50 years but had never made contact. The human governments had built secret listening posts throughout the solar system to prepare for the day when aliens finally found them. Hunter immediately sent an encrypted message to Earth's leadership. President Kate Sullivan and her military advisors had been preparing for first contact scenarios for decades. They had weapons, ships, and strategies ready for almost any situation. What they had not prepared for was learning that aliens had been actively avoiding them for thousands of years. The Federation Council spent 3 days arguing about what to do before Admiral Torres made the decision for them. He ordered Captain Morrison to approach the edge of the quarantine zone and attempt long-range communication with whatever civilization lived there. The Admiral wanted answers about why this sector had been forbidden for so long. Jake's hands shook slightly as he guided the Stellar Dawn toward the invisible boundary that marked the edge of the quarantine zone. His ship's computers had identified at least 30 large spacecraft moving through the Sol system. Some of them appeared to be larger than anything in the Federation fleet. Whatever species lived here had clearly not been sitting idle during their long isolation. Dr. Campbell monitored all communication frequencies as they crossed into forbidden space. Within minutes of entering the system, her equipment detected multiple signals aimed directly at their ship. The messages came in dozens of different languages and mathematical codes. Someone down there was not only aware of their presence but was actively trying to communicate with them. "Captain, they're using mathematics and basic physics in their messages," Campbell reported with excitement in her voice. "This species understands advanced science and has been monitoring our approach since we entered their system. They want to talk." Jake opened a communication channel and sent a simple mathematical sequence toward the third planet. The response came back within seconds, not just from the planet but from multiple locations throughout the system. Whoever these beings were, they had spread across their entire solar system and were coordinated enough to respond as one unified civilization. Admiral Torres received another emergency transmission from the Stellar Dawn 12 hours later. Captain Morrison reported that they had established basic communication with the unknown species. The beings called themselves humans and claimed that their world was called Earth. They seemed eager to meet with Federation representatives and learn about the galaxy beyond their system. The Admiral felt a mixture of excitement and fear as he realized that the Federation was about to make first contact with a species that had been deliberately isolated for thousands of years. Whatever had scared their ancestors enough to quarantine an entire sector was about to be revealed. Torres hoped that the ancient warnings had been wrong about the dangers that lay hidden in Sector 7G. Commander Hunter watched Federation ships gathering at the edge of human space and knew that everything was about to change. Humanity's long isolation was finally coming to an end. Whether that would be good news or terrible news for the rest of the galaxy remained to be seen.